Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 136. So many question and answers so far, and it's just going to get more in all likelihood. I'm your host, as usual, Panyo Basa, and I have decided to kind of change things up a bit just for the sake of being spontaneous and unpredictable. And so I'm starting with the emergency backup beverage tonight instead of the designated primary beverage, or DPB. The primary beverage is waiting while I drink the emergency backup beverage first. And also, for the sake of just innovation, I guess, I'm going with a red umbrella. So I'm just going to lick the beverage off the umbrella, throw it onto the desk, take a swig. Smooth. And I'm just going to commence to answering questions. And the first question is from Samana. And Samana says, what do you think of umbrella usage of Burmese monks? And I really don't think all that much about Burmese monks using umbrellas. I mean, some monks use a lot of umbrellas. They use them as parasols or sunshades as much as they use them to keep them from rain. And it actually works better as a sunshade because those paper umbrellas that Burmese monks use, if they're new, then when they get wet, this like reddish dye drips off of them and gets onto your clothes and stuff, which is not cool. So, I mean, with regard to umbrella usage of monks, I mean, you can say that it's kind of wimpy. A real ascetic wouldn't bother using a parasol or like an umbrella. And it is against the rules to use them in public. So if you see a monk holding an umbrella in public, even if it's pouring down rain, that's against the rules, unless maybe he's sick. Then he may have an excuse. But usually they're supposed to be used only like outside of populated areas, you know, like in the forest, like they're on the road walking from one village to another. You could use them then, or you could use them inside the monastery. And it is allowable in Vinaya texts, although it may be sort of a later development as monks were getting wimpier, you know, less hardcore in their asceticism, that somebody allowed them to use umbrellas. And yeah, I didn't use them much. I think I had one. Yeah, I did have one. I had an umbrella. In fact, I had like a Thai krot, or sometimes it's called a glot, which is a great big umbrella with a detachable handle. And there was like a mosquito net that would hang down, and there was a hook on the top. You could hang it from like the branch of a tree, and then you could stay underneath the tree without being eaten alive by mosquitoes. So I had one of those. It was kind of nice. Although, in order for the mosquito net to shed water, it's like really super fine mesh. It's like women's pantyhose. You can't really even see the holes through it. So the water just kind of sheets off the outside of it, but also it very much reduces air circulation inside. So there's no breeze coming through. And then you can just, I mean, there was one time I was living in a forest and I was using one of these krots that imported from Thailand, and it was so hot and humid that I'd sit inside the mosquito net until I was just sweltering, just drenching in sweat. Then I'd have to like get out from underneath it just to get some fresh air, and then just be eaten alive by mosquitoes till I couldn't stand being eaten alive by mosquitoes again. So then I'd go back under the mosquito net and just start sweltering and drenching in sweat again. It was just sort of back and forth. But what I think is more interesting from like a sociological point of view is the use of fans by Burmese monks, because it's sort of falling out of fashion. It used to be like 100 years ago that Burmese monks always carried a big fan with them. And it wasn't so much to like fan themselves in hot weather. It was used as a kind of shield, like 100 years ago and more, when a Burmese monk would give a sermon, he would be holding this fan right in front of his face so that you couldn't see his face when he was giving the sermon. But that wasn't the reason for it. The reason for it was to prevent monks from being distracted by like young, like nubile females in the audience. So he's like protecting himself from impure thoughts by putting this obstacle in between himself and the audience. But that has fallen out of fashion since Burma got independence from the British, I think. So with regard to umbrella usage in Burmese monks, you can say that it's kind of a sign of wimpiness, but still it's allowable according to the rules of monastic discipline, so long as they're not doing it in among the houses, like in like towns or villages, which they generally do. Just like they wear shoes in towns and villages, it's against the rules for a monk to wear shoes in populated areas. Also, he's supposed to go barefoot unless he's like unwell, or like the pavement is so hot that you couldn't walk on it barefoot without burning your feet, something like that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, and this is from Julianus, one of my favorite Roman emperors, by the way. And he says, can you comment on your next live how to get a job on a boat? What did you do? Tell us about your adventures. So how to get a job on a boat? Gosh, I mean, in my case, there were just postings. There was like a bulletin board in the biology department of my university. They just had like job postings. And one of the job postings was like a biologist working on board foreign fishing vessels that were mostly fishing in the Bering Sea, which is in between Alaska and like Siberia. And so I thought, well, it's a way of making money during the summer. So I did it, and then I just kept doing it because it was a convenient way of making money, and you only had to work like 6 or 7 months a year, and you couldn't spend your money while you were working because you were on a ship. You know, just like, you know, maybe pay your rent in advance or something. So, I mean, that was how I got a job on a boat. And I was a fisheries biologist, which meant that I was taking biological samples of what, mostly I worked on Japanese ships. So what the Japanese were catching, you know, what species, how many of each species, you know, the average weight, sometimes with some kinds of like high value fish, you'd be measuring, you know, proportions of males to females and their lengths and so forth. If they catch prohibited species like tanner crabs or king crabs or halibut or salmon, you know, you gotta like observe how they're treating them and what the viability is. You know, if they're going to be tossed back overboard, are they going to be alive or dead or dying, that kind of thing. And then send radio reports every week to the National Marine Fisheries Service in Seattle, just giving my reports on, you know, what they were catching, where they were catching it, you know, how much of each kind of fish they were catching, that sort of thing. Now it's foreign fisheries were being phased out towards like the 90s. In the 90s, the Americans were gearing up to catch the low value fish like pollock. You know, it's like the biggest fishery in the world 20 years ago. I don't know what it is now. It used to be like the Peruvian anchoveta fishery was the world's biggest fishery. That got replaced by the Bering Sea pollock fishery, which is what most fish sticks and like fake crab meat and stuff is made out of now. Merluccia producta is the scientific name of the Pacific pollock. And let's see. I'm not sure what got me onto that particular tangent, into that particular strain of tangential thought. But I mean, the biggest adventures I had, it was mainly just stormy seas. I mean, during the winter time in the Bering Sea, it's just pretty much a 3-month-long storm. So yeah, there was, you know, storms where the wind is blowing like 60 knots for 2 or 3 days straight. And it's just, the waves are just like these big moving hills, and I liked it. That kind of thing was very exciting to me. You know, it's just awe-inspiring, just the sheer power of nature. Although the Japanese didn't like it much. I mean, partly it's a safety hazard and all that. And also, what was probably even worse is they had to shut down the fishing operations and stop making money. And the Japanese, they just work like robots or slaves. You know, it's just all about making money. The only time they would pay any attention to the Shinto shrine in the wheelhouse. Every Japanese ship, pretty much, at least in the fishing fleet, has a Shinto shrine in the wheelhouse. The only time they would pay any attention to the Shinto shrine is when they wanted to make more money, like they weren't catching enough fish or something. So they'd make little offerings of sake or whatever. But with regard to getting getting a job on a fishing boat, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, now you can do a search on the internet for, fisheries, Alaskan fisheries. And, if you're not like a skilled fisherman, you don't know how to like mend nets, that kind of thing. If you know how to mend nets, you could probably get a job pretty easy. Someone who can tie nets, that's like a very valued skill. Or if you're a good cook, you can get a job as a cook on one of these fishing boats. And I worked on a crab boat once where the guys this was like back in the late 1980s. And the guys were complaining they were only making like $1,000 a day. And it wasn't even worth the time and effort to be there. It's like $1,000 a day. That's nothing. So, even the cook, he's going to be like a grunt laborer on the back deck when he's not cooking. So, he's making big money too. But, if you're not particularly skilled with regard to much of anything, you can still get a job on like a factory trawler, working down in the factory, processing, surimi, which is the stuff that they turn into fake crab meat, that kind of thing. But exactly how you go about getting a job like that nowadays, I can't really say. Your best bet would be to look up, shipping companies or like fisheries, some kind of company with like a fishing fleet, that kind of thing. If you have a degree in biology, maybe you could consult with National Marine Fisheries Service, something like that, and get a job as a biologist, which would be by far the lowest paid person on the ship. Because when people were on that crab boat, I was working for the Alaska Crab Coalition at the time, just doing a study on molting king crabs. And when the same time these guys are bitching about making only $1,000 a day, I was making maybe $100 a day. So if you're going to be a biologist working on one of these ships, be prepared to be by far the lowest paid person on the ship, because just grunt laborers with an IQ of 80 will be making several times more pay than you're making. Which is just the way it is. I'm not complaining. It's just a little bit ironic that I went to college to get paid, 1/10 of what some of these guys were making. So let's see. The only other adventures aside from storms, just catching people breaking the law and you have to report it. Or the Japanese, they actually go to seminars, or they used to. I was doing this job back in the 80s and 90s, or the 80s mainly. They go to seminars on how to deceive the fisheries biologist, how to have him look in one way when you're cheating in the other way, or how much you can cheat without it being against the law, within the margin of error kind of stuff. So the Japanese were tough to actually catch them breaking the law, even though they obviously were breaking the law. Still, they were very good at just very politely lying to your face, or just not saying much at all and getting away with it. The Polish ship I worked on, they were easier to catch. They weren't as good at cheating. They probably didn't go to those seminars. And let's see, just another kind of adventure-y kind of thing that was kind of exciting to me, but might not be exciting to other people, was just sometimes weird stuff comes up, especially if they're like trawling in deep water. You get all this weird deep water stuff coming up, like blob sculpins. There was one kind of, some of the fishermen called them a jellypuss. The American fishermen called them jellypuss. I never saw them in any like biology book, like marine biology book. It was, at first I thought it was a jellyfish because it was like jelly, but then if you look closely, you could see there were 8 tentacles with little vestigial sucker cups embedded in the jelly. And it was just like this disc. And to this day, I'm not exactly sure what they are. But they're obviously like a cephalopod mollusk related to the octopus that just kind of evolved in a different direction. So, I mean, that was kind of exciting to me, but that's about it. I mean, it was a long time ago. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libra Lamb, etc., 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 etc. And Stellar Supreme, etc., says, do you feel there is any issue with a Buddhist monk praying for others, like God bless them, or God lift them in spirit, if it's done out of a perceived, practical, holistic effect? And this is kind of a weird question. I mean, a Buddhist monk doesn't really believe in God. Presumably, most Buddhist monks don't. So, I mean, what kind of praying would it be if they're saying God bless them? I mean, sometimes as a Buddhist monk, like in a Western culture, I could say something like God bless you. I mean, I don't remember ever doing it, but I might think it or something. And it's sort of like translating God very loosely, into something that's sort of philosophically acceptable to a Buddhist. You just have to make the translation in your head. Or, I mean, if you were speaking to a Westerner, it might be a way of just kind of translating a Buddhist blessing into something that they would be more willing to accept or able to accept, something that they could understand more easily, that kind of thing. So I'm not exactly sure how Stellar Supreme, etc., has envisioned the monk doing these prayers. Is he doing them out loud or is he doing them inwardly? I don't know. I mean, if you're doing them out loud, I mean, to another Buddhist, I mean, it'd be just kind of silly. To a non-Buddhist, I mean, so long as you're being honest and just sort of like translating something into a term that they can understand and accept, it might be okay. But, I mean, inwardly, I mean, you'd have to do the same thing inwardly. Otherwise, I mean, if you're a theist, then you've picked pretty much the only religion or one of the very few religions that really does not cater to theists, let's say. So, after taking another drink of my emergency backup beverage, which I'm having first, and making sure that we are in fact recording, and we are, pretty sure we are, seems like we're recording, that I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe. And Master Poe says, are you a spring forward or fall back type? And he asked this question right around the time of daylight savings time taking effect in America. And I'm not sure if he means this figuratively, like in general, am I a spring forward or fall back type? Or if he's like referring specifically to daylight savings time. And if he's referring specifically to daylight savings time, I definitely prefer fall back, setting the clock back an hour in the fall, because you get an extra hour of weekend. Just recently, I was ripped off of 3 hours of my weekend because I had 1 hour of daylight savings time lost. And then I had to come to work 2 hours early because I've switched from 5 to 3 to 3 to 1, 3 in the afternoon to 1 in the morning, which works better for me, especially because I don't have to drive to work in rush hour traffic now. So specifically with regard to daylight savings time, I much prefer setting the clock back an hour in the fall because I get a whole extra hour of weekend. And with regard to in general, am I a spring forward or fall back type? Really, I'm just sort of kind of drifting forwards, I guess. Falling back, that's sort of retreating. Springing forward, that's just kind of foolhardy, I think. It's like one of the first suttas of the Samyutta Nikaya talks about how a monk, he doesn't swim and he doesn't sink, essentially. That's sort of putting it into American terminology. For the moment, the actual, like the Pali, what he's saying is escaping me. But it means essentially, he doesn't run and he doesn't sink, I think is how it's translated from Pali into English. And, it's like, it's sort of a thing that people read and don't know how to interpret it. So they just kind of just keep reading. There's some stuff in the New Testament, some Christians will read about, the the little bit of leaven put into the dough, which then leavens the entire thing of dough. They don't really understand what it means, so they just kind of just read through that and get onto something that they can understand better. And in these suttas, it comes up more than once. He doesn't run, he doesn't sink. Running, it's like you're not going with samsara, but you're not just lapsing into like some sort of unconscious trance state either. Falling back might be even worse than lapsing into a completely like neutral unconscious trance state, or semi-conscious, almost unconscious trance state. So yeah, I'm just kind of a drifting forwards kind of a person. Just kind of let whatever the force of my karma just continue moving me forwards through time, and dealing with issues as they arise, I suppose. Yeah, I'm not really highly directed towards future or past. The present moment is the best moment, most important moment by far. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the Saboteurs. And the Saboteurs says, what is the Bon or Bon religion? Was it original pre-Buddha Buddhism? And was there a paganistic predecessor to Bon? Well, it's my understanding that Bon is like Tibetan shamanism, which was like the primary spiritual tradition in Tibet before Buddhism moved into Tibet. And there's still Bon there. I think they're called Black Hats. Are they called Black Hats? I think they are. So there's still like a kind of Bon religion in Tibet that's probably very much influenced by like tantric, like Vajrayana Buddhism. Like Vajrayana Buddhism is heavily influenced by Bon also. So it's not the original pre-Buddha Buddhism, except in Tibet, because that's where Bon flourished. And was there a paganistic predecessor to Bon? Bon itself is paganistic. It's like shamanism. So there's like magic and that kind of stuff involved. And I have read it still exists as a tradition in Tibet, but there's been a lot of borrowing back and forth between like Vajrayana Buddhism and this Bon. And one of the reasons why Tibetan Buddhism is different from like other kinds of Buddhism is because it moved into a country where Bon, this kind of shamanism, was the prevailing spiritual tradition. And so, of course, when a new religion moves into a new territory, that it's going to be absorbing all sorts of cultural elements from that civilization. And the same thing is happening with like Theravada Buddhism moving into America and becoming like the Vipassana movement. So, yeah, the Bon religion is sort of like the indigenous shamanistic spiritual tradition of Tibet, which still exists there in vestigial form in Tibetan Buddhism, and also apparently in its own form, just separate from Buddhism, still in Tibet, if China hasn't persecuted them out of existence or some such. So, I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from a person whose name was in Cyrillic characters. And so I just put it into Google Translate to see hoping that Google Translate would also transliterate, so at least I'd know how to pronounce the name. And it came out that the name is Mongolian. I didn't know that in Mongolia they use a Cyrillic alphabet, and that it means ascetic journey. So, Mongolian ascetic journey says, how do you see the situation going on in Bodh Gaya lately? Buddhist monks are doing hunger strikes there. Well, I guess it's like, I haven't really kept up on it. I really do not know what the situation is like in Bodh Gaya right now. I went to Bodh Gaya like in the early 90s, spent several days there, walked around a lot, was hounded by beggars a lot. And the situation in Bodh Gaya is like right next to Bodh Gaya is a Shaivite temple with lots of those Shiva lingams and stuff. which was interesting. I walked around in there too. And Bodh Gaya was under, I mean, it was like buried under several feet of earth for many years, partly because it was sort of controlled by Hindus. I mean, it was sort of a Hindu majority in that area anyway. And so it was sort of under the control of Hindus, or earlier on proto-Hindus. And then somehow, maybe through the efforts of the Mahabodhi Society, this was like in the 1800s, that Buddhists finally got some kind of control over the temple area and, you know, the site of the Bodhi tree and all that. How the Bodhi tree was growing under, I mean, if you go to Bodh Gaya, you see that it's like this pit where the Bodhi tree is, you know, there's like embankments of earth around it that are several feet high, which indicates that they had to dig down. So either this Bodhi tree was planted after they dug way down, or it was like half buried, just under sediment. So the situation going on in Bodh Gaya lately probably isn't all that different from the situation going on in Bodh Gaya for centuries, with sort of a Buddhist minority, like an enclave of Buddhists surrounded by non-Buddhists, and they're trying to keep their holy site. You know, it's the holiest, the most sacred site in Buddhism, and according to general opinion, I think, Bodh Gaya is where the Buddha became enlightened. And yeah, I mean, it's just to be expected, I guess. I mean, monks going on hunger strikes for the sake of, you know, maintaining control over the Bodhi tree and the Bodh Gaya temple and all that. I'm not exactly sure what their motives are, so I can't really judge it, you know? So it would depend on their own motives. But this sort of politicking has been going on for a very long time. And yeah, I mean, it was going on back in the times of like anti-Buddhist Hindu kings in the Middle Ages. I'm not sure what the Muslims did, but I'm sure it wasn't very good. Whatever it was that they did to Bodh Gaya when they first got there probably wasn't very nice. But again, I really cannot say for sure what the situation is like at Bodh Gaya recently, because I haven't been reading up on the news and I haven't been there in quite a while. But it's going to depend on the motives of the monks there who are doing their protesting and so forth to determine whether they are well-guided or ill-guided. And so I'm just going to move on to Ascetic Journey's second question here. Is any spiritual or religious benefits for Hinduists to gain if they take over sacred places of Buddha or manipulate people that Buddha was some kind of Hinduism's figure? What would be your take on these stuff? Well, I mean, the Hindus have already, it was like in the Middle Ages, you know, late antiquity and the early medieval era, you know, it was like Buddhism and Hinduism were like, you know, it was sort of like Republicans and Democrats in America. It was like these two powers, these, you know, these two, I don't know, movements, I guess, two religions that are like striving to, you know, really become the religion of the masses. And there was a lot of back and forth, and the Buddhists were like in the ascendant. You know, the Buddhists were more powerful throughout much of Indian history. I mean, a lot of Indians, or a lot of people in general, don't realize that for centuries, India was a predominantly Buddhist country. Most of India was Buddhist from the time of Ashoka, you know, the 3rd century BCE, up until probably the Muslim conquest of most of India in the Middle Ages. So one thing that the Hindus did as a kind of propaganda tool is they just converted the Buddha into being an avatar of Vishnu. So according to the Hindus, the Gautama Buddha was God. He was one of the 3 main Hindu gods. He was Vishnu, although they then kind of twisted it so that he was the deceiver. He was like leading fake Hindus away from Hinduism, you know, to purify Hinduism, that kind of thing. But Buddhism and Hinduism have, I mean, they have been like lending and borrowing and swiping, like aspects from each other from the very beginning. Like the Buddha himself used a lot of Sanskrit, like Brahmanistic, like Vedic terminology. And I mean, there's a question about this later on. I think it's the very last question, where like Advaita Vedanta, and especially some schools of Mahayana Buddhism, it was like convergent evolution. They were getting close to each other because they were like borrowing ideas from each other. And also in India, ancient India especially, there was a tradition of public debates with regard to philosophy and spirituality and so forth. And it kept the religious system, the spiritual like atmosphere of India, very vibrant and strong. Because when you've got a monopoly, with regard, whether it's in economics or religion, then you wind up with like a lower quality product with jacked up prices. That's just the way monopolies work. But if you've got competition, like all these different schools like debating with each other and, sort of competing against each other, it keeps everyone on their toes, and it causes everyone to like fix the sloppy reasoning in their philosophy. That, I mean, some religious systems, they just have like, they have these doctrines that just cannot stand up to scrutiny. And one reason why they have the luxury of having these doctrines that can't stand up to scrutiny is they don't allow scrutiny. It's like they just clamp down, they persecute heretics. And, it's just, you've got this monoculture going. That was like Catholicism in the West for 1,000 years approximately. In India, it just wasn't like that. So there's a lot of borrowing ideas and lending ideas, and just everyone is like continually refining their philosophy just to stand up to the attacks of all these other philosophers that are attacking them. So I guess I should get back to the question though. Is any spiritual or religious benefits for Hinduists to gain if they, I never heard the term Hinduist before, but it kind of makes sense. If they take over sacred places of Buddha or manipulate people, that Buddha was some kind of Hinduism's figure. Yeah, well, I mean, for the Hindus to say that Buddhism is just like this weird branch of Hinduism, it sort of strengthens Hinduism because it includes all the Buddhists too. And it's good for propaganda, that Buddhism is just some sort of schismatic sect of Hinduism, which it isn't. But still, you've got the pride in, Bharat, you've got Indian nationalism, especially nowadays, where they're trying to like unify at least the main nucleus of the culture, which involves, using a little bit of religious propaganda. And I mean, the Buddhists did the same thing. Like they took Indra, the patron deity of the Indo-Aryans, and converted him into a Buddhist named Saka. It goes both ways. It's just sort of like dirty fighting going both ways to some degree. So spiritual or religious benefits from Hindus to take over Bodh Gaya in this case. I mean, they were in control of it for centuries already. And then they kind of lost control of it for a while. Now they're trying to get control of it back, going with the idea that Buddhism is just a kind of schismatic sect of Hinduism anyway. It's mostly like politics and nationalism more than genuine spirituality. And I mean, for a Buddhist, he can go and pay respects at the Bodhi tree regardless of whether the board of directors is Hindus or Buddhists. So it's really not that important of a thing, in my opinion. So that's my take on it. And so I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Meditator's Library. And Meditator's Library says, will you accept these suttas as first, second, and third sermon, genuine Buddhist teachings? First sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Second sermon, the Anattalakkana Sutta. Third sermon, the Aditta Pariyaya Sutta, more commonly known as the fire sermon. It's all on fire. Samsara is burning. Now, I was thinking to post them on my channel. Thank you. Well, it's kind of complicated. Like K.R. Norman wrote this controversial essay pointing out that the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is according to tradition, the Buddha's first sermon after he became enlightened is called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which means the setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion, the discourse setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion. He's first laying it down, whereas K.R. Norman points out that there are certain statements in this sutta that presuppose already knowing certain Buddhist doctrines. That it's, in a way, it's kind of anachronistic. And so you can say the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, it's not just pristine verbatim quotes of the Buddha. That it was a verbal tradition for centuries before things were written down. And the Indian mind really isn't, at least traditionally, really keen on accurate record keeping and historical accuracy and so forth. So there's been some changes made that it may very well be, there's no way of knowing for sure, it may very well be that something along the lines of the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta was, like the Buddha's first utterance. Like in that sutta, he's talking about the Four Noble Truths and the middle path. Those are like the two main things, and those are like two of the central tenets of Buddhist philosophy. So there's a very good chance of it, but there's no way to know for sure. With regard to the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, I'm not sure. That's mainly about no self. And that was the discourse that caused his first 5 disciples to become fully enlightened upon hearing that discourse. But there's no way of knowing for sure. That there are suttas that I think might be earlier, like suttas of the Atthakavagga. Some scholars consider the Atthakavagga to be so archaic that it may have been pre-Buddhist, and it was just that early Buddhists really liked the poems or the suttas of the Atthakavagga and just incorporated them into the canon. I don't think so personally. I think that the Atthakavagga represents very early teachings of the Buddha. But how, if they're more archaic in their message than something like the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, then how do you reconcile this? How do you make a chronological order? And I don't think there's any real way of doing that. It's all going to be guesses. You can't know for sure. Even if you had some kind of time machine where you can go back into the past, who knows? It may be that there's an infinite number of paths and you're just going into one possible one, in which case it's even more academic whether the Buddha really did have his first 3 sermons being the ones that are traditionally recognized as his first 3 sermons. Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, and the Fire Sermon. So, that's what it says, like in the Mahavagga of the Vinaya, which starts with, the early history of Buddhism, starting with the Buddha's enlightenment and what he did after he became enlightened. Those are the first 3 sermons that he gave. So, not including some little utterance he gave to an Ajivaka, who then walked away saying, well, maybe so. He's kind of shaking his head. So, your best bet is just to, if you're going to post these suttas as, the 3, just say that according to Buddhist tradition, these are the Buddha's first 3 formal sermons after his enlightenment. But, there's no way of knowing with 100% certainty. There's always going to be a certain amount of guessing involved. So, I think I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thought Fog. And Thought Fog says, do you go out of your way to go to any conventions? Art cons, UFO cons, builders conventions, Magic, the Gathering conventions, inshallah. Do you visit any type of conventions that have anything to do with your taste? No, I can't remember ever going to a convention ever. Not in the course of my entire life do I recall ever going to a convention. It may be that I did, and it just didn't really make an impact on me, so that I'm missing it right now. I'm not seeing it in my memory. So, yeah, I've never really been into that sort of thing. I've never even been to like a Buddhist convention, not even as a Buddhist monk. No, of course, that's partly because nobody ever invited me. The person that I was ordained with, who I think is still in robes right now, he went to some international Buddhist convention and gave a speech, but I wasn't asked to go, so I didn't. So, yeah, I mean, for me, even going to a county fair is kind of a big deal. That's about as close to a convention as I've gone to, I think, is just going to a county fair. Or when I was in college, I'd go to like biology seminars, that kind of thing. So I think I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Quaesitor, and Quaesitor said, did the Buddha reject asceticism on the grounds that the intention behind it was not specifically to cultivate equanimity? Well, he did not reject asceticism. Anyone who looks at the middle path and like the 13 Dhutangas, which are optional ascetic practices, not required on monks, but they are allowable, like never lying down, just sleeping in a sitting position, eating only one meal a day, that kind of thing. And that's relatively ascetic, especially from like a modern Western point of view. It would just be like just beyond the pale of what would even be considered acceptable. It's the middle path between self-indulgence and self-torture would be considered unacceptable self-torture by most Westerners. And so you have Western Buddhists wallowing in sensuality as a result. So, yeah, the Buddha did not reject asceticism. He rejected like deliberate self-torture. And there is a difference. I mean, Buddhist asceticism is you just kind of throw yourself on the mercy of the universe. You're not like deliberately hurting yourself like some ancient like ascetics were doing. Like one of my favorite stories of the Dhammapada commentary is this guy wants to become an Ajivaka. The Ajivaka, it was a spiritual tradition that was more popular in the Buddhist time than Buddhism was. Now it's now extinct, but they were like hardcore ascetics. They were so ascetic that they would make fun of the Buddhists as like shaven-headed householders. Shaven-headed lay people, they get to wear shoes. They get to use umbrellas. They get to use walking sticks. They just sneer at the Buddhists. Anyways, this guy, he wants to become an Ajivaka. So he goes to the Ajivakas. The first thing they do is they hold him down. They put 2 planks across his chest. And then the biggest Ajivakas there kind of sit down on these planks to hold him down. And then this other Ajivaka takes this special comb that they use, which grips the hair and just rips the hair off of his head and rips his beard and mustache off. And that was just to get him ready to join. So that kind of thing you didn't see in Buddhism. So, I mean, Buddhism wasn't as ascetic, but it certainly was ascetic. When you're wandering around homeless with no money, begging silently for your food in the streets, just sleeping under trees in the forest, that kind of thing, then yeah, that's relatively ascetic. They're not sleeping on beds of nails. They're not sleeping on broken glass, anything like that. But still, they're like avoiding pleasure and pain to the extent that it's convenient. I mean, some pleasures you just can't avoid, like taking a bath is kind of pleasant. Eating food is kind of pleasant. Sleeping can be kind of pleasant. So they just kept pleasure to a minimum and just kind of just living that lifestyle. Occasionally there'd be a certain amount of pain or discomfort, and then they would just accept that with equanimity without running away from it and without like seeking it out. So that's kind of the approach the Buddhists take, is just, you don't run away from it, you don't seek it out, and then you just deal with that, whatever comes your way. So I don't think the Buddha rejected extreme asceticism on the grounds that the intention behind it was not specifically to cultivate equanimity. It's just, it becomes a distraction. You're hurting yourself, and also you're making like bad karma against yourself. So like the Jains, they were trying to accelerate the burning off of their karma. They were trying to get their karma down to 0. Buddhists don't bother with that. Jains, they're trying to get their karma down to 0. And so they're trying to burn off their bad karma by accelerating bad things happening to them on purpose. And the Buddha just says that doesn't work. You're making more karma when you do that. So it was just counterproductive. When you're just messing yourself up so that your health is broken, for example. Your mind isn't clear because of just self-starvation and so forth. You can't practice Dhamma as well. So I'm just going to move on to Quaesitor's second question, which is, what are the origins of the concept of punishment or hell and reward or heaven outside of Buddhism? Well, that would probably go all the way back into like Stone Age animism. You know, it's like there'd be like taboos. You don't piss on the ground on this hill because the deity there, the spirit there doesn't like it. And he's going to fuck you up, possibly fuck up the whole tribe if you dare to piss on the ground there. Or, you know, you eat some forbidden species of animal that's sacred to the tribe, this kind of thing. That's probably where the concept of punishment and reward come from. Like if you make the offerings to the gods properly, you get rewarded. You're going to have better hunting, for example, maybe better weather, you know. And if you don't make the gods happy, you know, the deities, the spirits that are like more powerful than humans and are like controlling the weather and all this, if you make them happy, you get rewarded. And if you make them unhappy, you get punished. And that probably goes way back, way into the Stone Age, back into hunter-gatherer times. And then it just got kind of refined and modified until now you've got different theories instead of, you know, animism. So I'm just going to move on to Quaesitor's third question, which is, experiencing sensuality with mindfulness and equanimity seems to be an effective way of overcoming it. From your experience as a monk, do you feel that abstinence is a more effective method of losing interest in samsara? Well, it works differently for different people. It's not one size fits all. Like some of the best monks, including the Buddha himself, came from like a very self-indulgent kind of culture. They had it all. You know, anything they wanted, they could get practically, you know, within the realm of possibility. And some people that are like mature spirits, they've got some wisdom. They realize, you know, I've lived this life of just getting everything I want and I'm still not satisfied. So then sometimes this kind of person makes a better monk than like some Burmese Sayadaw who was ordained as a child. And, you know, he's never had sex. He's never had a drink of alcohol. He's never danced. You know, it's like he doesn't have the resistance to this sort of thing. He comes to America and it's like when alcohol or tuberculosis first came to North America, you know, it's like the natives there had no resistance and it just wiped them out. So, I mean, for some people experiencing sensuality with or without mindfulness and equanimity, I mean, just to get your fill of it and realize that it's just not going to help. But it may be that you're already riddled with STDs. Your health is already broken down by the time you have this realization. So experiencing sensuality with mindfulness and equanimity, that would be like Tantra. And I mean, for some people, it's an effective way, but it's playing with fire, metaphorically, almost literally, it's playing with fire, especially if you follow the fire sermon when samsara is in flames. So, I mean, for different people, it works different ways, and your own karma is probably going to guide you to the most appropriate way of practicing Dhamma. So, I mean, abstinence, in a way, it's like abstinence, it's sort of like a jerry-rigged kind of a solution to a problem. It's like you can't resist temptation, so you just avoid the temptation until you've got enough wisdom that you can resist the temptation. And it doesn't always work that way. Like you can become a monk, you avoid all these temptations. You avoid women, you avoid money, you avoid all this stuff, avoid all these luxuries. And still, you've got like the latent tendencies, the anusias, that just remain like uncooked seeds inside you, so that as soon as you're back exposed to it again, all these latent tendencies just come right up to the surface again. But it may be that you have enough wisdom that at least now you have a little more defense against temptation. but I'm not sure if I'm even answering this question. Experiencing sensuality with mindfulness and equanimity seems to be an effective way of overcoming it. I think most people that try Tantra just get lost in it. They just get sucked into the sensuality. You know, they're trying to do it with mindfulness, but there's like this subconscious, unmindful attachment that is forming and getting stronger without them fully realizing it until they realize that they're addicted to this or that sensual indulgence that they were doing as a kind of tantric spiritual practice. But it doesn't always work that way. You can deceive yourself with Tantra probably more easily than you can deceive yourself with just avoiding temptation altogether. So I think the Buddha was a very wise man, and at least for monks, he endorsed abstinence. So he probably knows better than we do, and he's the one who endorsed it to begin with. I mean, he wasn't the first, but for Buddhists, he was the first. And so I think best method of losing interest in samsara, to be a detached monk and just observe with a critical eye what the lay people are still doing. Like as a monk, as a young monk in Burma, the one time that I was happiest about being a monk would be whenever I would hear a screaming baby. You know, I wasn't all doped up on parenthood hormones, so I wasn't like numb to it yet or anything like that. And it was just awful. It's like, man, I really dodged a bullet. Although if I had to do it all over again, there's a good chance I'd have kids. So from my experience as a monk, do I feel that abstinence is a more effective method of losing it? Yeah, I think that all in all, it is the safest route, even though no route is perfect. Like abstinence, a lot of the time, you're just avoiding the temptation and not strengthening yourself against the temptation necessarily. Whereas, like mindful indulgence, like Tantra, it's so easy to just get sucked into it and deceive yourself into thinking that you're doing it right when you aren't. So all in all, I think abstinence probably is the safest route and the one that works the best for most people in the long run, at least most really serious people who are ready to renounce the world anyway. I mean, you have to be ready to renounce the world even before you do the total abstinence of a monk. I mean, lay people, there's a certain abstinence. You abstain from intoxicants. You abstain from adultery. You abstain from lying and stealing and killing. But monks take it to a whole different level where you're abstaining from just about any pleasure that is avoidable. You avoid it. And my nostrils are kind of not fully cooperating because I still have like the last vestiges of this cold that I caught like 2 weeks ago. So I suppose I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is from Psst. And Psst says, excuse me, I need to blow my nose. Just a second here. You don't have to watch this. It can get ugly. One moment, please. Yeah, there's hardly anything. It's like I don't really have a cold much anymore, but still there's like some last vestigial congestion or something. So anyways, Psst says, if we live in a world not real, be it virtual, why wouldn't a reset be viable? Living the same life over, facing the same challenges with the opportunity to make different choices. I guess I should mention that you did reference Einstein's theory of relativity, but because of the Webb telescope making scientists eat crow and going back to the drawing board, maybe just maybe our old boy Einstein is becoming irrelevant. Well, I don't know how the Webb telescope would change relativity. Maybe somehow. And also Einstein was like one of the first pioneers into quantum theory with his discovery of the photoelectric effect, which earned him the Nobel Prize, which he didn't get for his theories of relativity. But setting Einstein aside, going with my theory of the uncarved block of stone, you've got an uncarved block of stone, and inside that block of stone is every possible statue. Every possible statue is already in that stone, every molecule already in the right position, right? I mean, that shouldn't be too hard to figure out or too hard to understand. So, I mean, if every possible virtual statue is in there, and it's like samsara is, some of these statues form stable patterns and they can interlock in stable ways that, I mean, it can create a kind of virtual reality inside that block of stone, even though it's not ultimately real because the statues aren't carved. It's just imagination or delusion that carves the statues. Perception. So if every single possible statue is in there, then like a recurring cycle of statues would be in there also. But ultimately it doesn't really matter because the statues are not real. It's like a virtual conditional kind of reality. And I am reminded of one of the most mind-blowing books I ever read called Seth Speaks. It's this woman named Jane Roberts who was channeling a multi-dimensional entity called Seth. You know, he'd be like a Brahma or something, going with Buddhist terminology. And I mean, whether Seth really exists as a four-dimensional being or five-dimensional or however dimensional he was, or whether he was just like a concoction of Jane Roberts' subconscious mind, the stuff he said was mind-blowing. A lot of the stuff he said. And one thing that he did say is that rebirth doesn't necessarily work the way like Buddhism or Hinduism says it works, because there's also the possibility that you can just live the same life over and make different decisions. You know, it's like you just want to master this one life. And so you just keep living this one life over and over again, like Groundhog Day or something, and just kind of explore the different possibilities and try to get perfect. I mean, that's a possibility too. And I mean, it would be contained in the block of marble. Every single possible statue is in there. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think that that's the way that it has to work. I don't think that's the only way that it works, where there's like this reset. But I mean, if it really was a reset, then it would just be the same universe over and over again, unless you want to accept quantum randomness or something, just kind of causing slight butterfly effect drifts in different directions. Free will is logically impossible, in addition to not being endorsed by Buddhism. So, I mean, you don't have that. It'd just be the same thing over and over again, like Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. So, let's see. What is the actual question? If we live in a world not real, be it virtual, why wouldn't a reset be viable? Well, I mean, it's possible. It's just not the only possible way, and so it's not the only way. Because every possibility is contained in that block of marble. Some of them would form more stable patterns than others. And so, I mean, if anything is going to exist for more than a trillionth of a second, it has to form some kind of stable pattern. And like interlocking like entities can like help to stabilize the pattern, which then winds up with a certain flavor of samsara. So, yeah, I suppose I answered that question. I'm not sure how the Webb telescope is undermining like Einstein, but it might be. And I guess I have to be okay with that. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, every now and then you wear a t-shirt with a patriotic edge in your Q&As. When you don your fez, you usually sneak in a plug for that Fezorama site. Yeah, Fezorama makes really good fezes. How about telling us where we can purchase some of those cool t-shirts? Oh, you mean like this one? Let's see if you can get the whole thing in the screen there. Like that. Well, this shirt and another one that I wore a few Q&As ago, I got for Valentine's Day from my sweetheart, or for Christmas. I got them relatively recently from my sweetheart. I guess it was Christmas. And she ordered them from InfoWars, like the Alex Jones site. And she said, I mean, there's other places where she could get the same kind of t-shirts, but she just wanted to support Alex Jones because he was being persecuted. You know, he was at the verge of destruction. He really was just right at the verge of just being sued into oblivion by leftist activist judges. Now, he was being sued literally for billions of dollars for stating his opinion, probably his honest opinion, that the Sandy Hook shooting was a kind of hoax. And I think it was Elon Musk helping him to lawyer up and finding like legal irregularities in the whole bankruptcy procedure, and like the people bidding on buying InfoWars was like the Daily Onion, which was like a satire site, and it turned out that they didn't even make the highest bid. It was just the judge decided it would be better for society if some parody site gets control of InfoWars, which was illegal, and the whole thing collapsed. And of course Trump won, so that now it's the persecution of right-wingers, or just people who are capable of like rational thought, is very much reduced now. But also, in addition to InfoWars, one of my favorite T-shirts, the one with the Mulon Labe, and it has like the ancient Corinthian Greek helmet with like a Confederate flag on it. That I got that from a local shop called Dixie Republic, which sells all kinds of like Confederate propaganda or Confederate paraphernalia, memorabilia, let's say. Although their Confederate flags are all made in China, so I wouldn't buy a flag from them. I went there to get like one of the Betsy Ross flags with the 13 stars in a circle, and they were all made in China, so I just wound up getting the shirt. But if you're ever in the vicinity of Travelers Rest, South Carolina, there is a store there called Dixie Republic, where you can get, like famous engravings of like Confederate Civil War heroes and this kind of thing. And I got a shirt there. So, I mean, Dixie Republic might even have a website, so wouldn't surprise me nowadays. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, someone asked a question about a monk asking for money. Yeah, that was the very first question of the previous Q&A, I think. I'll start over because I just interrupted myself quite rudely. Dhamma River says, someone asked a question about a monk asking for money, and he actually mentioned the monk's name and description, so there can be no doubt of who it was. Well, there could still be some doubt because there is more than one monk by that name, but I just interrupted myself again. I wonder what your opinion is regarding calling out monks publicly like that. I have mentioned before that I have lived in Thai Buddhist temples and witnessed famous ajahns doing things that, let's just say, they shouldn't do. But I never publicly denounced them. Should we call out monks publicly for misbehaving, or would that bring us bad karma? I don't want to bring disrepute to the Sangha or discourage others from ordaining. I always thought it was better to ask the question in general terms without mentioning specific names, but at the same time, I don't want to be an accomplice to the misbehavior of monks. Thoughts? Well, let's see here. Like any action, physical or verbal, is morally neutral except for the volition that is motivating it. So if you're like wanting the Sangha to be good and you're calling out a monk who is behaving very badly, if you're doing it out of respect for the Sangha and desire for the Sangha to prosper and to be relatively pure, then you're not doing anything necessarily bad. And lay people in the Buddhist time were calling out bad monks. There was like the rule against a monk touching a woman, that some woman, the wife of some wealthy man, I think, paid to have this kuti, this meditation cabin built for a monk. And then the monk is showing her that this cabin that she had built, or she's showing him, they're both there alone together, and he keeps like rubbing up against her and stuff, just for the sake of, getting pleasure from the contact, rubbing up against this presumably attractive woman. She goes home and complains to her husband about how that monk was touching me the way you touch me. And then he starts complaining to just anyone who will listen. These Buddhist monks, they're like feeling up my wife, this kind of thing. Then the Buddha made the rule, when it got back to the Buddha, he made the rule, no monk is allowed to touch a woman with desire for the contact, for desire for pleasure, when his mind is perverted inflamed by lust, this kind of thing. So, it can result in good results to call out the misbehavior of a monk, especially if you're sure. If it's just a rumor, you heard this rumor that some monk is doing something wrong, you shouldn't be going around saying it unless you're sure. And sometimes even if you're sure, it's your own call whether to publicize this or not. But you shouldn't do it out of hatred for a monk. Any action motivated by hatred is going to be immoral. Regardless of the action, if it's motivated by hatred, it's going to be an immoral action. But any action that's motivated by respect and sincere intention for Dhamma to grow and prosper, to be strong and relatively pure, then what you're doing really is not a misdeed. It's not bad karma, regardless of the shitstorm that may ensue as a result of you saying it. So, what is my opinion regarding calling out monks publicly like that? If it's just something minor that most monks do, like handling money, then you might as well just make it a generalization. 98% of Burmese monks handle money. You don't have to name names unless there's just some really outrageous example of some monk that's charging exorbitant fees for giving Dhamma talks, I shouldn't say it. But if it's a really egregious case, if you know of some monk, somebody in robes, some dude in monk's robes who's seducing nuns or something like that, he's not even a monk anymore. Or if he's stealing, I knew of a monk, I used to know this monk, who was exchanging Burmese currency on the black market for US dollars before leaving the country. And technically, he was smuggling contraband money, which was a parajika, which I'm pretty sure is a parajika offense. He's excommunicated. He's not even really a monk anymore for having done that. It's kind of controversial whether, smuggling money out of Burma is, smuggling American dollars that you got on the black market out of Burma, whether that's a parajika offense. It could qualify as what's called sunka gata parajika, which is essentially evading customs or that kind of thing. Getting something through the black market. So let's see here. I mentioned before that I've lived in Thai. Okay, should we call out monks publicly for misbehaving, or would that bring us bad karma? Yeah, I think that if there's some high-profile monk who's doing something really bad, I've called out Bhikkhu Bodhi before for supporting female reproductive rights or women's reproductive rights, this kind of thing, which is a euphemism for abortion. And from the Buddhist point of view, abortion is murder. And so if any woman at all took Bhikkhu Bodhi's advice, who was motivated by what Bhikkhu Bodhi said, and got an abortion, Bhikkhu Bodhi would be excommunicated for the rest of his life. So, sometimes it may be worth the effort or worth the potential trouble to call out a particularly corrupt monk for the sake of just trying to purify the Sangha to some degree. So yeah, I don't think that's necessarily that bad, but if you're doing it motivated by hatred against that monk or aversion for that monk, that you just don't like that monk, you want to see him get, just kicked out of his monastery and disgrace, that kind of thing, then you're better off using general terms, especially if the monk's doing something that lots and lots of other monks are doing, that isn't really a scandal, just handling money. And then you're better off just using generalizations, because that applies to most monks and not just one. So those are my thoughts, I guess. And so I'm going to move on to Dhamma River's second question. And he says, this is also kind of a long question. You talked about evil sounding music, and lately I've noticed seriously demonic imagery in some K-pop videos or Korean pop. I have also seen this in rap music in the US. There seems to be some kind of karmic contractual disclosure on the part of the artist through the display of demonic imagery, and the viewer can choose to pay attention or choose to ignore the demonic imagery, but the images are being shown nevertheless. This is where seemingly the agreement is made and most people just don't pay attention to it. Most people unfortunately ignore all the demonic warning signs and they just enjoy the music. Do you know if there is some kind of interdimensional energy harvesting going on through modern music? And when I read this question, it definitely reminded me of when I was in Bali in Indonesia. I met an American trumpet player. He was a black jazz musician from St. Louis. And he was kind of a conspiracy theory oriented guy. He had lots to say about the Rothschilds, for example. He was afraid to come back to America because he was afraid he'd just get like arrested upon arrival in America by white supremacist security guards at the airport or some such. But anyways, so, I mean, bearing that in mind, he did say that it's almost the only way to really make it big in the music industry lately is through joining this cult. And I think the being he referred to is Baphomet. That there's like, you know, it runs rampant in the music industry, this secret worship of Baphomet. And I mean, take it or leave it, I have no way of proving or disproving what he told me. I mean, he was a musician, he's a good musician, and he's kind of living in exile in Indonesia. And I mean, he's the one that maybe he had some inside exposure to this. You know, they're trying to get him to like offer the chicken to the statue or something, and he just wouldn't do it and just left the country or whatever. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure why there's so much satanic and demonic stuff. I mean, anyone who remembers back in the 80s, I mean, I think Black Sabbath was one of the first bands to really start this stuff up. And I mean, even Black Sabbath wasn't necessarily taking the side of the devil. You know, I mean, they were like talking about how the devil's going to run rampant because of the degeneracy and corruption of society and all that. It wasn't until later, like, you know, AC/DC, if you're into evil, you're a friend of mine, and all this kind of, you know, it kind of sparked the satanic panic back in the 80s, I think. So I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, some like artistic types just really like to push the envelope. You know, they just like to just push things, and it could be that gratuitous and for the most part insincere demonic imagery is just their attempts at being edgy, something like that. Or there could be some real like Satanism or like demonic worship stuff going on in like among higher ups in the entertainment industry. It wouldn't surprise me at all. I just don't know which one it is for sure. So, I mean, it could be interdimensional energy harvesting. Yeah, I do think that there are like demonic beings that are worshipped that are kind of egregores. It's just like all the energy, like the psychic energy poured in from thousands of followers just feeds this thing and gives it existence, really. You know, it's like there could be other beings that are coming in that aren't just purely egregores that really are feeding on this, I don't know what you'd even call it, this cult mentality. But which one it is, whether it's just made up or whether there really is some demonic cultish stuff going on in the entertainment industry, or it's, in all likelihood, it's probably a combination of the two. But I really can't say for sure. So, yeah, I would be careful though that about like demonic kind of music, because even if just at the surface level you don't give a shit about the imagery, I mean, you're just listening to the music, you're not even watching the videos, but still, I mean, some of the stuff can get in like what's the word? Subliminal. That, I mean, it's like your subconscious mind is getting like polluted with this stuff subliminally. But I mean, you're big boys and girls, you're adults, you can make your own decisions. And, I listen to Led Zeppelin sometime, like I mentioned, I think it was the previous video, where, Jimmy Page, he was into that kind of, he bought Aleister Crowley's house, where there were like demonic images painted on the walls and some kind of blood and all this kind of stuff, that he may have made some kind of 10-year deal with the devil. And, it's like In Through the Outdoor was right after the 10 years expired, I guess. Or maybe even Presence. I was not impressed by their album Presence at all. So, yeah, it's possible. I don't know for sure, but it's plausible. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Zenithoid. And some people do ask me questions where, even referring to early Buddhism, was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta really the Buddha's first sermon? You can't really know the answer to these things. Even someone with like clairvoyance who looks into the past may still be mistaken. They may be looking into the wrong past of an infinite number of equally real pasts, or equally virtually real. So some questions you really, nobody can really answer them for sure. Not that I know of. So anyways, I'm just getting on to the next question. This is from Zenithoid. And Zenithoid says, can you give your opinion on chemtrails? Well, when I was a kid, they weren't called chemtrails. They were called comtrails. And it was, I guess, people who think that these comtrails from jet planes flying overhead are like laced with toxic chemicals or something, started calling them chemtrails. I'm not sure what the chem means, but I'm pretty sure the main ingredient in a comtrail is just condensation. It's just cloud, it's water vapor. It's just, it's not smoke. They look essentially the same as clouds. It's just a long straight line of a cloud. So until I see some evidence that jetliners are spewing toxic chemicals out in these comtrails or chemtrails, I still prefer to call them comtrails, that they're just laced with some sort of toxic chemical, possibly as part of some kind of conspiracy to lower the IQ of people in Western civilization or whatever it is, then I'm going to remain skeptical that chemtrails, so-called, really are any kind of dangerous thing, that it's, there's going to be like trace amounts of jet fuel or something that wasn't fully oxidized when it was being burned, that kind of stuff. But for the most part, I think it's pretty much just water vapor. So I'm just going to move on to Zenithoid's second question, which is, how fucked would America be right now if Kamala won? Well, that's hard to say, but I think you can just extrapolate. Just extrapolate from the Biden administration, just another 4 years of the Biden administration, with Kamala Harris not really running the country any more than Biden was. Recently they found out that most of his signatures on the bills that he signed and everything weren't even really his signature. They were just duplicates. It was just like rubber stamped. And even when he did sign something, he probably didn't even know what he was signing. They'll just say, here, this is important for the country. This is good for the economy. Sign this. That kind of thing. So, yeah, how fucked would America be right now if Kamala won? It would be just sort of continuing in the same direction that it was moving when Biden was president. Also, like, the EU would be emboldened. The leftists would be emboldened. There'd probably be more of a crackdown on censorship than there is now. That the flood of illegal migrants would just continue to flow. And they'd be doing everything they could to fast track citizenship. They're like planting them in swing states so that the swing states will just turn blue and become, leftist states reliably. And then they would just kind of lock down, all this USAID stuff, USAID, sort of underground slush funds to like prop up leftist, like, grassroots movements, supposedly paying for leftist propaganda, paying for leftist protesters and all this. That would continue with nobody being the wiser. Nobody would know about it, just like we didn't know about it a year ago. that this was actually happening. That, I mean, some people would probably suspected that something like this was going on, but now we got pretty much proof of it. So, yeah, we just continue down the road of feminization and castration of Western civilization, and pretty much all of Western civilization would be fucked, except for maybe Eastern Europe. But now we got more of a chance of actually maintaining at least one ball. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Xenothoid. How long do you think it will take for Trump to actually get prices back down? Well, gas prices are already going down. Egg prices that were such a big deal are already going down, even though the raised egg prices were apparently a deliberate, like a conspiracy. You know, it's like using bird flu as a pretext for killing off millions of chickens and then blaming Trump when the price of eggs is high. So I don't know how long it will take exactly. I'm no economist. Some prices are already going down, like the prices for producers, you know, the factories, that's already going down. When fuel prices go down, the price of just about everything goes down because everything has to get trucked somewhere, and you got to use like motorized farm vehicles to grow crops and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, prices are already starting to go down, and they'll probably continue to go down. But I'm no economist, and so I really can't make any kind of decree or authoritative utterance on the subject. But apparently some prices are already going down. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Indiana Dhamma. And Indiana Dhamma says, how important is historicity for the validity of a religion? For example, if an historical Jesus never existed, it wouldn't really impact the wisdom of teachings like let not your left hand know what your right hand is doing when performing acts of charity. Likewise, the validity of the Four Noble Truths wouldn't be affected by the non-existence of the historical Gautama Buddha. Well, I think he picked, it's kind of not a very good choice what he picked for Christianity. Like, for example, he says, if an historical Jesus never existed, it wouldn't really impact the wisdom of teachings like let not your left hand know what your right hand is doing. But that's really not what Christianity is based on. What Christianity is based on, much more than this little tidbit of wisdom regarding charity, is that Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, and he died for our sins, and he is the way, the only way to heaven. And if Jesus never existed, that whole narrative just collapses, doesn't it? So how important is historicity and the validity of a religion? It depends on how much that religion insists upon historicity and relies on that historicity as like the foundation of what it teaches. With regard to Buddhism, what Indiana Dhamma says is pretty much correct. Even if the Buddha never really existed, Dhamma remains an enlightened tradition. It remains very wise. But if you've got a religion based on this person is the only begotten Son of God who died for our sins, then if that person didn't exist, you're still living in original sin, no matter what you do. So it depends on how much the religion is like using as a foundation the biography of its founder or any other kind of like historical claims. If it's purely abstract, which is what Buddhism pretty much is, at least Theravada Buddhism, it's just philosophy. I mean, the biography of the Buddha is pretty much irrelevant. It's there for people with devotionalistic tendencies who really want to revere the founder of the tradition. But, I mean, the biography of the Gautama Buddha is largely irrelevant. Whereas the biography of Jesus is certainly not irrelevant to Christianity. With regard to Islam, it's kind of hard to say. But to some degree, Islam also relies on the idea that, I mean, God is one God and Muhammad is his prophet. So if there wasn't a Muhammad, then the Quran presumably would be suspect, at least. So how important is the historicity for the validity of religion? It depends on how much the religion is like relying on historicity. If it's purely abstract, like Buddhism is, or not so much purely abstract, it's just not relying upon the biography of this or that person or any sort of historical claims that, even if the Buddha just never existed at all, Dhamma still remains pretty much intact. Whereas you can't say that with regard to Christianity. Either Jesus died for our sins or he didn't. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mr. Pranav. And Mr. Pranav says, we're in kind of a historical vein at this point. Do you think if Alexander had continued his conquests, would he have been successful in conquering India? At the time of Alexander's invasion, Magadha was ruled by the Nanda Empire, which was pretty powerful. I think they may had a chance to defeat him, but what do you think? Well, I don't know if the Nanda Empire was more powerful than the Persian Empire, which was pretty damn powerful. I think that, the only military technology that the Indians had that may have stopped the Greeks would be war elephants. I'm not sure how familiar Alexander and his troops were with fighting against war elephants. Like a war elephant could be scary. They got like a chain on the end of their trunk, and they're just whipping it and just like flattening entire platoons of soldiers in front of them. Then, that can be scary. But once you learn how to deal with elephants, like the Romans did, they weren't afraid of them anymore. All you got to do is just take a wheelbarrow full of like straw or hay, set it on fire, and then push it towards the elephants. Elephants are afraid of fire. They'll just immediately turn around and start trampling their own troops to get away from the fire. They're afraid of fire. So I think Alexander, he did have a military technology that was new in the world that no other army could really stand against, and that was called the phalanx. It was just this wall of soldiers, like maybe 6 or 8 deep, with 20-foot long spears. And you couldn't get close to them. You could shoot arrows at them, but they also had shields. And so they'd just get behind the shields until you're done shooting arrows. But still, there's these 20-foot long spears that you somehow have to get past if you're going to hurt those soldiers, unless, of course, you're doing it with arrows. And really, it took a while. Finally, the Romans figured out a good way of defeating the phalanx, which is one reason why Rome rose in ascendancy. It became more powerful than the Greeks, because they could deal with the phalanx better than the Greeks could deal with a Roman legion. But the ancient Indians, pretty much the only thing they had going for them that was anything that might have caused problems for Alexander's troops would be war elephants. And according to the story, when Alexander first crossed the Indus into what was considered Indian territory, his first major opponent was King Porus, who, it's some sort of like Hellenized version of an Indian name, I assume. And it was difficult. They were having difficulty crossing the river, and it was a hard fight. So Alexander, it wasn't just an easy win over the first Indian army that he defeated. It was a difficult fight. He had to trick Porus by, he was marching most of his men back and forth at the river, making it look like they're getting ready to cross, whereas he sent some of his best troops way the hell upstream, miles away, to cross up there where nobody was expecting them to cross. And then they were able to come and make a flank attack, which then distracted them enough that Alexander's troops were able to win. But I think Alexander probably would defeat any Indian army, including armies of the Nanda Empire, so long as they knew how to deal with war elephants. And Alexander's successors started relying heavily on war elephants. Like the war of the Diadochi, I think it's called, where Alexander's chief generals were fighting against each other, trying to get control of as much territory as they could after Alexander died. They were relying heavily on war elephants, and war elephants were significant in the victory of the winning side. So I don't know. It depends, like I keep saying, on whether the Greco-Macedonian army knew how to contend with war elephants or not. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Kyundru. Let's see. I'm just scrolling down a little bit. Okay, Kyundru. Kyundru says, in Thailand and Laos, I've noticed that when monks are invited to chant at a recently deceased person's home, they usually chant Patthana and the Matika. Is this practiced in Burma as well, and why do you think these texts in particular are chanted during chanting ceremonies? Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not exactly sure what the Matika is. I mean, there is no book in the Tipitaka called the Matika. There's no group of books in the Tipitaka called the Matika. It's my understanding that the Matika originally were a kind of proto-Abhidhamma. And Patthana is the seventh and last book of the Abhidhamma Pitaka, which, like I was mentioning in a previous Q&A, is mainly dealing with causal relations. It's how different things relate, or how they have relation, how they relate to each other, how they cause anything in the other. You know, how causality works is essentially what Patthana is about. And it's so abstract, so complicated, that it's pretty much unreadable even for Abhidhamma scholars. So this is the first I've ever heard that in Thailand and Laos, monks, like when they're invited to chant at a recently deceased person's home, they will chant Patthana and the Matika. I've never heard of that before. In Burma, generally, they just chant Parita. And Parita is just like the protection chants, like the suttas, some of which are in the Sutta Pitaka, and some of which are like apocryphal, that are chanted just to give blessings, and they're considered to have some sort of beneficial effect on like subduing ghosts and keeping trouble away, that kind of thing. Helping people in their health, that sort of thing. So, yeah, in Thailand and Laos, I mean, you might want to ask a monk in the Thai or Laotian tradition why it is that they do this. I mean, I mentioned in the previous Q&A, I'm pretty sure, that in Burma, they do have what's called a Pathanpue or Patthana festival, where they will just chant Patthana like day and night, just constantly for days. And the reason they do that is just to keep the Tipitaka alive, because according to tradition, that Patthana being the last book of the Tipitaka, that when the Tipitaka fades out due to impermanence, it's going to be the last parts of it that fade out first. So when the Burmese are chanting Patthana, they're just making sure that Dhamma doesn't fade out by preserving the last text, because the last text is going to be the first to fade out. So why the Thais would do that for a recently deceased layperson, I don't have a clue. I do not know. Unless it's something similar to what the Burmese are doing, or maybe it's just some meaningless tradition, or like a tradition that used to have a meaning because it was done for a different reason, and then just kind of got corrupt, because just meaningless traditions run rampant in Theravada Buddhism. Like in Burma, almost every formal act of the Sangha is a meaningless corruption now, except for the ordination ceremony. The ordination ceremony still has some meaning. Almost every other formal act of the Sangha is so corrupt as to just be meaningless blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, I really don't know why Patthana would be chanted in like honor of a recently deceased lay supporter. There doesn't seem to be any obvious logical reasoning behind that. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is kind of a strange one. This is from Fred. And Fred kind of asks strange questions sometimes. Sometimes you don't even know if for sure he's even expecting an answer. But I'm going to answer this one. So Fred says, I think the Buddha definitely showed the scaffolding to Nibbana, but as you have pointed out, there are so many contradictions. Is it really a worthy goal? And then as a sort of commentary to that, he says, whether there is no self is academic, there is still a meat puppet on the receiving end. For example, hitting your thumb with a hammer, no self, no pain. So, I mean, the main question, see, I think the Buddha definitely showed the scaffolding to Nibbana. And even that kind of phraseology is kind of strange, scaffolding to Nibbana. That, I mean, just sort of like the framework of practice that will help you to attain Nibbana, I hope is what he meant. But as you have pointed out, there are so many contradictions. Is it really a worthy goal? So you've got a treasure map showing you where Alaric's treasure was buried. You know, it's just this vast treasure, and it was buried. The people who buried it were then put to death. Nobody knows where it is. And you've got a map that has some contradictions to it, but is it a worthy goal? Well, it's still a vast treasure, isn't it? And Nibbana is even a vaster treasure than the burial site of Alaric the Visigoth. Is there anybody out there who knows if Alaric's treasure was ever found? It was like he just rampaged through the Roman Empire, you know, when Rome was in the state of collapse at the time, and just, I mean, they got so much treasure they could hardly carry it all. And then Alaric died, probably of a disease. And so they just diverted a river in southern Italy from its course. And then they had some people bury all this treasure, just tons of gold and silver and pearls and jewels and stuff. And then they got the river redirected on its correct path, and they just put to death all the people who saw where it was. And I don't know if they ever found that or not. It'd be this huge treasure in Italy somewhere. But I mean, it's such a weird question. I mean, is Nibbana really a worthy goal simply because there's like garbled instructions from 2,500 years ago? I mean, the instructions that count, the important instructions, are still fairly good instructions. It's not very many people that become enlightened. So, I mean, you can say that Dhamma is really an extremely inefficient way of becoming enlightened because so few people actually succeed. I mean, that's a valid argument to make. But that doesn't mean that enlightenment is not a worthy goal. I mean, you just want to wallow in samsara just because, well, there's no 100% accurate and certain and reliable way of becoming enlightened for, you know, anyone at random. Then I don't know what to say. But certainly, Nibbana is a worthy goal, regardless of whether you choose to go after that goal or go look for Alaric's treasure in Italy or wherever it is. So anyways, I'm just going to move. Oh, wait. He says, with regard to his commentary, that with no question mark. I thought it was another question at first, but there's no question mark at all. Whether there is no self is academic, he says. But, I mean, I don't know about that one. There's still a meat puppet on the receiving end. But, I mean, the meat puppet, whether it's real or not, is kind of important. I mean, it really does alter, like, the whole strategy of becoming enlightened to some degree, or just it can, like, help to detach you from samsara and increase your odds just right off the bat if you realize that samsara isn't some kind of, like, set in stone ultimate reality that there's just no escape from other than just death and oblivion. So, I mean, that wasn't really a question, so I won't dwell on it. I'll just move on to Fred's second question, which is kind of an interesting one. Fred says, is Agni worship the reason monks can't have fires? And no, that's not the reason at all. It's according to the original story, the origin story for the rule against a monk building a fire to warm himself unless he is sick, that there was a snake in the firewood. And the snake started chasing the monks around when they're trying to build this fire. Or it was like sleeping inside a hollow log, and then it came out, it woke up from the heat and started chasing the monks around. And then because when you build a fire, you're very likely killing small creatures, that's the main reason. It has nothing to do with Agni worship. There might be like another contributing reason in that some philosophical groups or spiritual groups like the Jains believed fire to be a kind of primitive proto-life. And so for a Jain monk, it was immoral to build a fire or put out a fire, because in a way you were like making karma by creating this proto-living thing and then making like bad karma by killing this proto-living thing. And in a way, there's a certain insight to that fire really is a kind of proto-life, that respiration, like the metabolism of almost all living things, other than maybe anaerobic bacteria, it's a kind of like moderated, graduated oxidation reaction, which is the same as what fire is doing. It's just that it's done in little increments, and some of the energy given off is then captured through molecules. Like ADP becomes ATP, which it energizes the molecule, which can then be used in various functions in the cell. So yeah, fire could be considered a kind of proto quasi life in a way, and so in ancient times it may have been like looked down upon for like ascetics to be putting out fires or building fires for that reason too. But the main reason in the Buddhist texts is that when you build a fire out of firewood that's been lying on the ground or whatever, that there's all kinds of small creatures that live in this firewood, like little beetles living under the bark and little scorpions and maybe a big snake that's inside a hollow log, that, they can die. And so you shouldn't do it just for those reasons. So Agni isn't mentioned at all, really. The god Agni is not specifically mentioned at all in the Pali Tipitaka that I can remember. He certainly is not a significant figure in the Pali Tipitaka. So I'm just going to move on to PSA. And I think maybe it was PSA. I can't remember who asked the question. Somebody asked me, like, why is the Philippines spelled with a PH and a Filipino is spelled with an F? And then somebody in the comments actually answered that question who has Philippine ancestry, because I didn't have a clue. Turns out that the Philippine language doesn't even have the F sound. So it's all just Western artifacts with regard to the spelling the name and everything. Yeah, I think I chose correctly in drinking the emergency backup beverage first. I was just in the mood for it. Smooth. So anyways, PSA, if you want to know why the Philippines as a country is spelled with a PH and a Filipino is spelled with an F, just look in the comments to the previous Q&A. Because he knows better than I do. I would have been clueless with regard to answering that question. So anyways, PSA says, what's your favorite sutta of the Digha Nikaya and why? That's kind of a tough one. I really do like the Sakapanya Sutta. And the main reason why I like it is because the central portion of it, the questions that the god Saka is asking the Buddha, it strikes me as very archaic. It's like a proto-Paticca Samuppada. It's like an early prototype of the 12 Nibbana link of Paticca Samuppada, even though it's not really explained as that. That Paticca Samuppada originally wasn't this, in my opinion, wasn't this sequential list of different things. But some suttas, like the Digapanya Sutta, are like, somebody asks, what is the cause of this? The Buddha answers it. And then they say, well, what is the cause of that? And then the Buddha answers that. And then, well, what is the cause of that? And then you wind up with this chain of this causing this, causing this, causing this. Another good example is the Kalaha Viwada Sutta of the Atthaka Wagga in the Sutta Nipata. And then it was these that formed a kind of nucleus for the 12 Nibbana theory of Paticca Samuppada, or dependent co-arising, because, as the Buddha correctly predicted, almost nobody was really going to understand dependent co-arising, including most Buddhist monk philosophers. And so they had to like simplify it into something easily understandable, so that even though the Buddha predicted almost nobody's going to understand this, Now, almost every Burmese monk who's had a year of schooling is going to say they understand it because they memorized, the 12 links in Pali. And they still don't understand it. And then anyways, the Sakapanya Sutta also contains this weird love story. At the very beginning and then at the very end, you've got this Gandhava in Sanskrit called a Gandharva. They're sort of like an elf or a fairy, a supernatural being, like a lesser god that serve as like musicians for the higher gods. And so there's this Gandharva named Panchasika, or Five Crest, who is Saka, the king of gods, wants to talk to the Buddha. He knows that the Buddha doesn't like being bothered. He doesn't like lots of noise and commotion. So first he sends this elf, Panchasika, to go and kind of soften up the Buddha, prepare him for a visit from Saka, king of gods. And so Panchasika goes there and he sings this erotic love story. In a way, the introduction to the Sakapanya Sutta is like the Theravada Buddhist equivalent to the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament. It's like this erotic love poetry that is like got a little bit of religion added to it, and so it can be like interpreted as a kind of religious allegory. But obviously, in both cases, it's fairly raunchy love poetry. He's like praising the breasts and thighs of his beloved, this kind of thing. And anyways, the Buddha apparently approves. And so the Buddha is like allowing Saka to come visit him. Saka comes visit him, asks him all these questions, which forms a kind of archaic proto-dependent co-arising. And then at the end, Saka is so satisfied that he rewards Five Crest, the Gandharva, with this woman, this princess, this goddess princess that Saka was, or that Panchasika was mooning over. So, I like that sutta mainly because it contains like this large element of like apparently archaic Buddhism, like pre-Theravadan Buddhism, which served as a kind of prototype for the later developments of dependent co-arising. Although like the the Mahaparinibbana Sutta also, it's kind of a touching, moving kind of story about the final days and death and cremation. No, I don't think the cremation was included, but the final death, the final days and death of Gautama Buddha is the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And also the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which I was trying to say to begin with, that's just classic. That's like the Bible for Vipassana meditators. The Mahasatipatthana Sutta, it's just how to do mindfulness meditation, how to do mindfulness, how to do Vipassana. So I'm just going to have to go to the designated primary beverage, the DPB, with its own paper umbrella. Don't want to recycle them too much because it might make me look like I'm uncivilized or something. And this is, well, maybe I shouldn't say it now. It's like an ultra latte. It's like half coffee and half milk. But there's a question about that later on, I think. Oh, here we go. Oh, PSA. So what's your favorite sutta of the Digha Nikaya and why? I already mentioned Sakapanya Sutta would probably be my favorite. Also, Mahaparinibbana Sutta, very touching, moving story of, the end of the Buddha's career. Mahasatipatthana Sutta is just the Bible for Vipassana meditators. Even like the very first sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the Brahmajala Sutta, Brahma's net, the divine net, where he pretty much shoots down every possible philosophy. That's like proto-Majjhimaka, really. And also the second sutta of the Digha Nikaya, which is the Samanyapala Sutta. That's an old cardinal sutta that's an important one. And you can learn a lot about Dhamma from reading the Samanyapala Sutta also. But my favorite, maybe I would guess, would be the Sakapanya Sutta. So anyways, PSA second question is, could you please talk about this week's beverage in great depth? this week's beverage. The primary, or is it the designated primary beverage, or is it the primary designated beverage? Designated primary beverage. I think that's the correct way of saying it. And this cup I gave to my sweetheart for Valentine's Day. I gave her 2 of them so that I could drink out of one of them. It's very nice. And as I already said, it's like organic Colombian coffee mixed with, it's not organic milk, I have to admit, but it's whole milk, whole cow's milk, bovine glandular secretions. I don't know. I think in order to go into greater depth, I'd have to like give like a chemical analysis of it, and I just don't have the equipment here. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pedro. And Pedro says, what's your opinion on memecoins? We recently saw Trump launch his own token on the Solana chain called $Trump. Many, I guess it's Trump bucks. I think that they call them that. Many people seem to be making significant profits trading these, but at the end of the day, it feels like pure speculation, almost like a mix of gambling, currency trading, and art investing, all wrapped in blockchain technology. So what's my opinion on meme coins? I really just, it's not really on my radar. I have no cryptocurrency at all. I don't even have Bitcoin. None of it. So in a way, it's sort of, it strikes me like there was like this fad, and I can't even remember what they're called now, just purely digital, like something that was being sold for like memento value, or memento. I mean, just, I can't remember what it was called now, but in a way, these coins, I mean, there's nothing backing them up. I mean, the value is arbitrary. It's just sort of based on like popular opinion, how much they're worth. And in a way, it is kind of like art investing, since like you can look at some painting that's just a splattered mess of modern art. And I mean, it might be selling for like $50,000. And I mean, the value of it is just purely arbitrary. I mean, it's just like this artificial, somebody decided it and other people are willing to go along with it. So, I mean, our actual currency, like the US dollar, probably isn't so different now. I don't know if there really is still gold at Fort Knox that's supposed to be backing up American currency. I mean, obviously, it's fairly likely that there's nowhere near enough gold to actually back up our currency, that our currency also is just like fiat currency that's just really nothing backing it up. At least Genghis Khan, he had like paper money, or it was like leather or something that didn't have any intrinsic value other than if you refused to accept it, he'd have you put to death. So it was like his money was backed up by your own blood. So in a way, there was some value to it, more than to like US currency probably now. So my opinion on meme coins, I really don't have much of an opinion. I do think that it's just this weird cultural phenomenon, sort of like the tulip craze in the Netherlands back in like the 1800s, or it's a kind of fad, a kind of mania, where people are just giving great value to something that is ultimately not valuable at all. It's just the people. So there's enough people willing to attribute a certain value to it that it causes it to have an effective value. But pretty much everything is like that to some degree, even gold. I mean, it's kind of arbitrary that it's so expensive. It's the demand makes it expensive, but the demand for gold itself is just kind of, it's just a sort of a cultural artifact. So I think I'm just going to move on to Pedro's second question, since I really am not a money expert. Pedro's second question is, this also raises an interesting question. What is the Buddhist perspective on gambling? And yeah, gambling is considered to be immoral. There are suttas that warn lay people against gambling. I mean, you get a bad reputation, you can squander your wealth. You know, there's like a list of various reasons why you shouldn't gamble. Although, on the other hand, life itself is a gamble. Even a farmer who is planting perfectly good seed grain in the hopes of getting a big harvest next year. I mean, that's the kind of gamble. You don't know if there's going to be a drought that's going to just kill off your crops. So, I mean, life is a gamble to some degree. So that's unavoidable. But the main kind of gambling that was done in the Buddhist time in northern India, I think, was with dice. And that kind of gambling is really not approved of in the suttas. So where you're going to put like cryptocurrency with regard to that, I mean, it's going to be a judgment call, I suppose. I mean, the Buddha's not going to be endorsing very much with regard to handling money anyway. All of his most serious disciples were strictly prohibited from handling money at all, unless they found somebody else's money lying on the ground at the monastery. Then they were obligated to pick it up and put it in a safe place until the layperson came back for it. That's the only time that a monk is allowed to handle money, unless there's a monk is forfeiting his money, which almost never happens. He's forfeiting his money. It's like, I had this money, I surrender it. I relinquish this money. And then the Sangha can appoint some other monk to take that money and go throw it out in the woods somewhere. So those are like the only two cases in which a monk is allowed to actually touch money. But getting back to lay people, I mean, it's not included in the 5 precepts, cryptocurrency. You know, so it's technically it's not immoral in that sense of being in violation of a precept. Even playing dice for money isn't really against the 5 precepts, even though it is discouraged in the texts. So, Buddhist perspective on gambling. Yeah, it's not technically a violation of the 5 precepts unless you're like cheating at cards or something, cheating at dice. But it is discouraged that you really should not do it. But then again, where do you draw the line? Because life itself is a gamble. You know, when you're saving something for a rainy day, you're gambling that you're not going to be struck by lightning or like just drop dead from some obscure cause before the rainy day happens. You know, there's always some kind of gambling involved, but mainly Buddhism is discouraging of just what is generally called gambling, which nowadays, you know, be slot machines and like lotteries, cards, dice, roulette wheels, that kind of thing. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, thoughts on Yuttadhammo Bhikkhu? To me, he seems like someone who has really progressed in his practice. And to tell you the truth, I'm not even sure who Yuttadhammo Bhikkhu is. Like I've said before, I'm really not keen on keeping up with like the Western Buddhist scene. Yuttadhammo Bhikkhu, I mean, is he the one that's like in Canada, like in Montreal? I remember that when I first came back to America in 2011, trying to live in the West as a monk, there was a supporter who had supported Yuttadhammo Bhikkhu. I think it was Yuttadhammo. It was some monk trying to set up in Canada. You know, he just came from Asia, and he was staying in this supporter's mother's basement for a while. So he and I were in kind of a similar situation at first, although he succeeded by eventually getting a Sri Lankan group to support him. And once you get Asians supporting you, it's fairly easy. But I really wasn't trying to get support from Asians so much as, I mean, if I wanted to be supported by Asians, I might as well just stay in Asia. So I was trying to be supported by Americans, which for various reasons just didn't work out very well. But aside from that, I don't know. I think maybe somebody told me that Yuttadhammo Bhikkhu was originally Jewish or something. I don't know. I could be completely confusing him with somebody else, and it shouldn't matter anyway. But yeah, I just am not 100% sure even who he is. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, how liminal do you think the Dhamma is? And liminal, I mean, I use the term liminal. I mean, I think liminal literally means like a threshold, like a doorway or an opening that can be entered or exited. And it's key to a book that I've read some years ago now, The Trickster and the Paranormal, which is a theory of how the paranormal works, written by George P. Hansen. And the paranormal works through liminality. It's like you've got a certain structure, like a stable structure. In order for anything to exist for more than a trillionth of a second, there has to be some stable pattern involved. But it's not perfect. There's like cracks and crevices in between the laws and the rules that keep our world like regular and safe and predictable. So, I mean, even just the natural law isn't good enough for us. The laws of physics aren't good enough for us to like keep everything stable and regular. So we also have to have human laws and taboos and so forth that give greater stability to our world and keep the scary paranormal at bay. That's one of the main reasons why we have so many like cultural conventions and so forth, is we are trying to standardize and stabilize samsara well enough that there aren't as many cracks and crevices between the rules and the regulations that will allow in from like the primordial chaos, maybe paranormal phenomena. And so anyways, Rui's question, how liminal do you think the Dhamma is? It depends on how you practice it. Like the average Burmese person, you know, they have an approach to Dhamma similar to the approach towards Roman Catholicism of a medieval European, where in a way, Dhamma reduces liminality because it's giving structure and, you know, it's like explaining stuff and just sort of keeping the unknown at bay. You know, it's giving structure to their lives, and so it is reducing liminality. But the more advanced you get in the practice, when you start getting into like really subtle meditative states where a lot of the structure just evaporates, then it becomes way more liminal. Like anyone who has done a lot of intensive practice may tell you from experience that weird coincidences, synchronicities, and so forth are much more likely to happen when you're doing intensive practice. And then when you get up into the level of being like some really advanced jhana master with psychic powers, then that's all paranormal. I mean, you've gone like full blast liminal at that point. So it depends on what level and how you interpret Dhamma, you know, how advanced you are in the Dhamma. So that, I mean, for a beginner, it can actually reduce liminality. Whereas if you're really advanced, it vastly increases liminality. So I'm just going to move on to Rui's second question, which is, did the study of the Dhamma bring you to the threshold of the conditioned? And I'm not exactly sure what he means by the threshold of the conditions, other than just leading me to like liminality. And the study of the Dhamma didn't really do it, because when you're studying Dhamma, to some degree, you're studying patterns and regularities that reduce liminality. The real liminality comes not so much from study. I mean, sometimes it can, like Zen-like stuff or just paradoxical stuff or stuff that really challenges your point of view. Let's say you're locked into this worldview, and then you read some book that challenges that worldview, even though it's very structured and regular also, because it's sort of weakening your faith in your own structure and regularity. I mean, it can cause liminality to occur. But as a general rule, what takes you to the threshold of the conditioned, so to speak, in Dhamma is practice, especially meditative practice. You know, when you stop thinking, you know, all these cultural rules and regulations and regularities and taboos and all that, and they just fade out, at least temporarily. And so you have faded out a lot of the structure that holds the paranormal at bay. You have vastly increased liminality of the situation. And I assume that's what he's talking about when he says, did the study of Dhamma bring you to the threshold of the condition? Yeah, I've been brought to the threshold of the condition a few times. Like before I became a monk, I think the main vehicle towards the threshold of the condition was LSD. I would take LSD like on average maybe 2 or 3 times a year, just as a way of just kind of blowing the carbon out of my pipes and just sort of, I don't know, it was like a spiritual practice, really. I had spiritual experiences usually every time I would take LSD as a young man. Sometimes I would take LSD alone out in some wilderness area. I remember one time I was in college and I was taking a Religions of India class, and we had just been studying, this early Vedas. And so I actually did like a little Vedic sacrifice out in the woods on LSD. I didn't sacrifice an animal though. It was like incense and purified butter and that kind of thing. Reading some random hymns from the Rig Veda. So to some degree, but I mean, it wasn't just that. And I was just kind of born with a certain liminality. So to some degree, it's just sort of an innate talent. It's just something you've acquired through parami, as the Burmese villagers would say. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we're getting towards the bottom here. This is less than 2.5 hour long video, methinks. And this one is from Terzaskazis, who is going under the alias of Captain Bogumił Klamka. Bogumiv? I don't know, the L with the line through it in Polish, is that a W sound? Bogumił? Why would anyone name their kid Bogumił? Doesn't make sense. Anyways, Terzaskazis, because that's who it is, says, would Advaita Vedanta be close to original Buddhism? And that's kind of an interesting question. And in a way, Advaita Vedanta is fairly close to original Buddhism, although Advaita Vedanta is way more philosophical, because the original Buddhism was sort of anti-philosophical. It was anti-conceptual. You weren't supposed to think about reality because thoughts cannot contain reality. So, anyways, what happened was you had this archaic Buddhism that was like anti-philosophical, but then maybe as more beginners and less, and like when the Buddha started Buddhism, most of his followers were veterans, relatively spiritually advanced. But then as Buddhism struck traction in Indian culture and started becoming more popular, then it may be that the Buddha had to start giving like elementary philosophical instructions to people who weren't ready yet for like fourth jhana. So you started getting some like basic philosophy with regard to karma and rebirth and, dependent core rising and so forth. And then after the Buddha passed away, it was like a snowball effect. Just the Indian mind is at least in the Buddhist time, the northern Indian mind was just like analytical and philosophical and wanting to explain everything and just proliferate the philosophy. And so it just became this huge scholastic edifice. And then you had some of the early Mahayana schools, like Madhyamaka, were actually a kind of reform movement getting back towards like the archaic message of, you're never going to figure out reality by thinking about it. But the way Madhyamaka did it was through like logic chopping, I think it's called, where, you're using logic to destroy itself. You're just using this withering logical scrutiny to just kind of debunk everything. And you save your own point of view for last and then turn it towards yourself for a kind of philosophical self-deletion. And the thing is, when Advaita Vedanta was being developed, like Sri Shankaracharya is considered to be like the main like founder of Advaita Vedanta. that he was getting a lot of ideas from Madhyamaka Buddhism. So Advaita Vedanta and Madhyamaka Buddhism have a lot of similarities because there were ideas borrowed back and forth probably between the two, especially ideas borrowed from Madhyamaka into Advaita Vedanta. And so since Madhyamaka was like a reform movement trying to get back to some degree, to some semblance of what archaic Buddhism was teaching, then yeah, I would say Advaita Vedanta is close to that extent to the original Buddhism. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Thermal Squid. And Thermal Squid got these questions in right under the wire, just like an hour before I sat down to do this video. And so this is the last questioner, and he asked 3 questions. These are the last 3 questions of this Q&A. And so Thermal Squid says, have you ever gotten into a nasty verbal altercation or yelling match with someone in public and felt bad afterwards despite being in the right? And he's got the right in like scare quotes. And I can't remember getting into like a yelling argument in public with anybody. The closest thing that comes to mind was when I was living under a big rock ledge on the outskirts of Alondo Kathapa National Park in Burma. And I had read this book called Battle for the Mind, which is a life-changing book for me by William Sargent, where he's talking about how we are locked into like habit patterns. And these habit patterns, it's like a ball and chain. You can't really make progress because you're just like identified with, attached to these habits. And so what is required in order to break free of this conditioning is you have to be thrown into a kind of crisis, like an emotional crisis, where your usual way of dealing with reality just doesn't work anymore. And this is how like Chinese thought reform worked. It's how like political interrogation in Stalinist Soviet Union worked, where you would get the person not only to admit to trying to overthrow the government, but to actually believe that he was trying to overthrow the government. It's how like a lot of like religious conversions work, like early Methodists work this way. It's how like Stone Age manhood rituals work. It's how basic training in some militaries work, where they just put you under so much strain that you just kind of break down. And then once you break down, once you hit this crisis stage, it's like you become very open to suggestion. It's just this instinct. You cling to your habits, even if they're not making you happy, so long as they're good enough to get you through life. But once they stop working, it's this instinct that you just kind of become very susceptible to suggestion. And so I had read this book, and I was trying to experiment with that to some degree by just sort of triggering a crisis in myself. It seemed like so long as you don't have this crisis, you're not going to make significant like progress. And it helps to have a wise guide there to help put the pieces back together when you have your breakdown. But I didn't have that luxury. So I'm out there alone in this forest, kind of triggering a breakdown in myself. And I came to the verge of it. I was doing fairly well at causing myself to break down just through the stress of living in this environment, just in this forest, just alone, doing intensive practice and everything. And then the rainy season started. The first rains of the monsoon started. And so what happened after the first rains of the monsoon is that all these young villagers go off into the forest catching frogs. It's like you've got frog orgies going on. As soon as the ponds fill up with water, it's just this deafening roar of frogs giving out their mating calls. And then you've got the villagers come and they just catch these big baskets full of frogs. And then the next day you go for alms round and you're getting all these dismembered frog parts and frog eggs and stuff in your bowl. So, ostensibly they're Buddhists, but out in the remote hillbilly areas, the Buddhism is just kind of a superstition that isn't taken extremely seriously in certain respects. I once asked one of the older villagers, I mean, do any of the young people actually keep 5 precepts? Or I asked, does anybody in the village actually keep 5 precepts? And he just kind of chuckled and said, only when you get old. You know, when you're too old to get into trouble, then you stop doing that kind of stuff. So anyways, there are all these young people. I mean, it was kind of like a party. You know, they're just yelling and laughing all through the forest, killing frogs. And I was just at this crisis stage, you know, at the verge of a crisis anyway. And at one point I'm standing on top of this hill, seeing this crowd of like teenagers laughing and joking and heading out with their bags and baskets to catch frogs. And I just started yelling at them in Burmese, if you live like animals, you'll die like animals. And, I mean, it was just kind of like this, I don't know, like this kind of a episode I was going through. I was just so disgusted with these people that, I mean, they really didn't, I mean, they had like this superstitious respect and reverence for Dhamma. They certainly had this reverence for me, but really, I mean, they'd kill anything. They'd eat anything that was at least as big as a grasshopper. You know, I've seen guys walking out into the forest and a duck would walk by. They just frantically look around for anything. They just pick up a stick or anything and just fling it at that duck in the hopes of like knocking it down and killing it. So it was just all the strain and stress just caused me to just kind of snap that night and just start yelling at the villagers about how if they lived like animals, they were going to die like animals. But I mean, I kind of felt embarrassed about it, or, you know, like, well, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. But that's about as far as it goes with regard to nasty verbal altercations or yelling matches with someone in public. Because I can't remember ever like getting into like a yelling argument with somebody in the middle of a Walmart or something like that. I've never done that. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question, which is, would you agree that heavily extroverted people are insecure or otherwise energy parasites? And I don't think that all extroverted people are that way, but a lot of extroverted people, or just kind of shallow people, it's like they need the approval of others around them to kind of keep their self-esteem high enough that they don't just go into like this clinical depression. You know, it's like someone who is like extroverted to the point that they rely on the approval of others just in this deep emotional level. If all of a sudden they were just like called out and ridiculed and disgraced, they'd just be crushed. Unlike like the introverted person who really doesn't care about public opinion all that much, that would really soldier through the scandal much more, with much more fortitude than the extroverted person who is like getting so much gratification from it. So, I mean, whether it's that way to the point of being energy vampires, I assume that it's sort of a mutual energy exchange between like entire peer groups where, you know, it's just sort of like mutual support is sort of, you know, maybe their mind is kind of too weak to live in isolation. So they sort of form together into a colony, you know, sort of like a psychic colony that is like mutual support through like mutual approval. And if anyone's ostracized from that group, they better find another group pronto, or, you know, they're just going to be plunged into this utter despair because they just have not cultivated enough self-reliance and enough like moral backbone to just be independent of that. But I don't think that all extroverted people are that way. I do think that there are certain types that are that way, though. And so, after maybe I blow my nose one more time, it's not even really mucusy anymore. It's just that it's still like a little bit congested and the air doesn't want to flow through right, so that I try and make certain sounds when I'm talking and they're not coming out correctly. Okay, then. So, last question from Thermal Squid. how you reconcile a more masculine ethos that isn't afraid to defend itself or assert itself, and renunciation of a mindfulness about the futility of worldly contentions. So that's the question. How you reconcile a more masculine ethos that isn't afraid to defend itself or assert itself, and renunciation or a mindfulness about the futility of worldly contentions. And then as a kind of commentary after this, he says, all three questions are contextually related. Got into a fight with a woman who gave me a terrible attitude for not acknowledging her within 3 seconds of opening the door to my business, and it went nuclear. Didn't feel good about it, but I have a really hard time taking it from people. Well, this question, how do I reconcile a more masculine ethos that isn't afraid to defend itself or assert itself, and renunciation or a mindfulness about the futility of worldly contentions? It reminds me of something that William James wrote in his classic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, how he points out that most men assert their masculinity through like aggression, like sports or driving like maniacs or joining the military as 18-year-olds, that kind of thing. How traditionally masculinity has been largely a matter of aggression and just fire. Yeah, I mean, aggression has been a factor of it. It wasn't like the whole thing, but there's always or usually a fair amount of aggression in just traditional masculinity. But William James points out that like a spiritual alternative for a man to assert his masculinity is through asceticism, through austerity, where you've got to be tough to be like a Buddhist monk in ancient India. I mean, they were tough as wood. These were tough men. And ancient Buddhism, despite its non-violence and so forth, I mean, it's about as masculine of a spiritual tradition as there has ever been devised. Possibly more masculine than Islam, because it was formulated by just these tough masculine male ascetics who avoided women like the plague. So, I mean, femininity really didn't have much opportunity to get into these texts at all. And even a lot of the nuns that are described in the texts are just the inventions of male monks who wanted to write a story about a nun. So, yeah, I think the masculine ethos in Dhamma would just be fearlessness. I mean, there's definitely masculine virtues in traditional Dhamma, just fearlessness, like austerity, just sort of a disdain for pleasure or even comfort, that kind of thing. That, I mean, it takes a considerable amount of bravery and toughness to be the kind of ascetic that is described in the oldest Pali texts. So, I mean, let's see, defend itself. I mean, just being able to fearlessly take a beating without flinching. Even that, I think my father was a very macho guy, and he got in lots of fights when he was younger. And it wasn't very often that he would get beaten in a fight, or that, he'd be fighting someone that he knew was in all likelihood able to beat him. And in such a case, he made it a point to just look that guy right in the face when he was taking the beating. He wasn't going to flinch. He was just going to take it from the guy, and just show him that he didn't give a shit that the other guy could beat him up. And that's kind of a masculine thing. I mean, I don't know if that would be considered toxic masculinity from some castrated, feminized eunuch, but still, I mean, it definitely took some backbone and some fearlessness. So, I mean, just not turning the other cheek isn't necessarily feminine. Let's see here. How do you reconcile a more masculine ethos that isn't afraid to defend itself or assert itself? You can. Asserting oneself. Yeah, I mean, that is basically delusional. To assert yourself, you're insisting upon you are asserting some kind of samsara based on delusion. So, I mean, to the extent that a masculine ethos is based on like egocentrism and delusion, I mean, to that extent, obviously, you're better off without it. Even a tough guy would be better off without it. But there are certain aspects of a masculine ethos, like I've already been saying, like fearlessness and just like unflinching determination, that is a masculine virtue. And I mean, you can do that as a monk ascetic or as a soldier. The fearlessness, you can do that as an ascetic monk or a soldier. Or, let's see, just the disdain for comfort, you can do that as an ascetic or a soldier. I mean, there's a lot of overlap. It's just that the actual, like the aggressive parts are, they don't really wash in Buddhism. And just defending yourself to the extent that you're defending yourself just out of a like egoism, that, I mean, that wouldn't be allowed, although a monk is allowed to strike out in self-defense. And just asserting yourself, the masculine ethos isn't afraid to assert itself. I mean, any kind of assertion, I mean, you're essentially asserting some kind of delusion. So, yeah, that may not work out so well. I mean, a monk isn't supposed to make any assertions, at least not in the oldest texts, when the monks were the toughest. So, how do I reconcile a more masculine ethos with renunciation or mindfulness about the futility of worldly contentions? Most of a masculine ethos translates into worldly renunciation fairly well. It's just the aggressive parts and the deluded parts that don't work very well. And you're better off without the delusion, especially. It may be that you're in some kind of situation where you may have to assert some aggressiveness. Like, let's say you've got a family to protect. Then, yeah, I mean, it's your duty. If you haven't renounced the world, then, yeah, you're going to have to adopt a somewhat different ethos than a monk renunciant who is striving to become a perfected saint. A lay person who's got a family to protect may not be able to afford to be a perfected saint. So, I mean, Buddhism, it's like the highest level of practice isn't for everybody. It's not even for most people. It's for a tiny minority, a kind of spiritual elite. And of course, a lot of Western and westernized Buddhists just can't stand the idea of an elite, even if it's a genuine spiritual elite. It's just, let's just have mandatory mediocrity for everybody. So, yeah, the reconciliation is not total, unless you're going to be a Buddhist layperson who still reserves the right to defend yourself and defend your family and defend your home, which really is kind of your duty as a layperson who has a family or a home. And that's it. I guess I answered that question. I hope so, because I'm done. And like I should always say at the beginning, it's just a habit now. It's just not my habit to announce this at the beginning. So I guess it's the people who watch the whole show or listen to the whole show get the reward at the end of me saying, if you got any questions about anything you think I can answer, feel free to ask them in the questions below the video. And no more than 3 questions per person, please. And like the video if you liked it. And smash the subscribe button this time, I guess. Usually I say smash the like button, but I already said something about the like button. So I guess you're just going to have to smash the subscribe button if you haven't already. And be happy.